Now to Edward P. Morgan at the White House.
This majestic monument to George Washington is serving as a kind of tombstone tonight, measuring in its height the height of sorrow of Washington, the capital, for a fallen president. Even the bloodshot winking lights on its peak warning against airplanes themselves are symbolic of the sorrow and anger that Washington feels. People's official windows, the windows of official offices are still bright with lights. The government goes on, and indeed the shift of government officials from high to low is working under grief and under pressure for the transition that has already technically taken place to President Lyndon Johnson. About all that the people in Washington, and people, including the people here in the West Executive Wing of the White House, where Press Secretary Salinger has his office, and where the correspondents ordinarily assigned to cover the president have their offices right here. About all that people can do tonight, besides sorrow, is to reminisce over the times of when they first met this remarkable man who is now dead. Reminiscences, in a sense, are a kind of a cheap thing, and yet, inevitably, what is there else to talk about among friends and among strangers on a night like this? This correspondent remembers first meeting John F. Kennedy when he was running for the Senate against a man named Henry Cabot Lodge in Massachusetts in 1952. By an ironic and unexpected twist of history, Cabot Lodge has been President Kennedy's ambassador in recent weeks of high emergency and tragedy and drama too to South Vietnam, and has been on his way home for other purposes. At that time, Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic candidate for President of the United States, and as a correspondent, I was covering Stevenson in Massachusetts when he came into the state to campaign with Kennedy. There was a certain coolness between the two politicians then, and there remained a certain coolness between them, but a great deal of mutual respect grew up over the years. After all, that was, incredibly enough, 11 years ago. Needless to say, John F. Kennedy clobbered, as they say on the sport pages, clobbered his opponent, Cabot Lodge, in that election and moved from the House to the Senate. And inevitably, as almost every other correspondent covering the Hill and the White House in Washington did, this reporter met him personally and socially. He used to like, with his wife, to have little dinners at his house on N Street in Georgetown. Anything but pretentious dinners they were. A couple of correspondents and their wives or girls, some official of the government, some colleague from the Senate, sitting down to a good dinner and having good, serious talk with a little banter from Mrs. Kennedy with her delicious wit thrown in between to spice the courses, so to speak. I remember that I felt it necessary at that point, at one time, to repay the hospitality of the then Senator Kennedy, and I invited him and Mrs. Kennedy to my house for dinner one night in Georgetown. They accepted. I remember that Dean Acheson and his wife were a couple of the other guests, but as the time for dinner came, I, as the host, and I suppose most hosts and hostesses do in this particular position, began to squirm because the Kennedys had not arrived. A half hour went by, and they still hadn't arrived. 45 minutes went by. Myself and my other guests were there, nervously drinking our drinks. The dinner was getting overcooked, and then the telephone rang. It was Senator Kennedy. He was all profuse apologies. By some unavoidable but unfortunate mix-up, he had been given my office number at ABC way out on Connecticut Avenue instead of my home, and he would be there in a moment. Needless to say, there was great relief. They came. and we had a lively evening. I didn't know until that moment that there had been a certain sharpness between the former Secretary of State, Mr. Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and the senator, partly because the elder man who had been versed greatly in affairs of state and diplomacy thought that the younger man was something of an upstart. And he was a bit, more than a bit, put back by Mr. Kennedy's speech in the Senate, which became celebrated at the time, denouncing the Western approach, and particularly the Washington approach. That would have been the policy of the then Eisenhower administration toward the situation of the Algerian War. And there were a few sharp, if controlled, exchanges between the two that evening, but it led eventually to a very close working relationship and, again, mutual respect between the two. The next morning, I received by special delivery a package from Mrs. Kennedy, along with a charming note saying how much she and her husband had enjoyed the evening, and would I accept in apology a little pot of Strasbourg pâté de foie gras. I did with relish. This was the way the senator worked himself into the respect and into the affection, I might say, of a good deal of correspondence in Washington, treating with them easily, being easily accessible, being frank with his relationships. And there are others much more intimate who were much more intimate with him than I, who could tell many other stories about him. The situation, it goes back to his nomination in 1960, when it was incredible that Lyndon Johnson be on the ticket. But I happened to be in the automobile with him the afternoon of the crucial vote on his own nomination, and asked him if he were nominated, as he was confident that he would it be Hubert Humphrey, his running mate, or who? And he said, no, no, no. If I get it, we'll have to start all over again. And if I, as a correspondent, had had any sense, I would have known then that he was thinking actively of Lyndon Johnson. Now, I would like to show a videotape of an interview that some of my ABC colleagues and I had some months ago with Lyndon Johnson before he became president.